Good morning. Today is March 26th, a Thursday, and we are continuing with our look at Mark. Today we will be picking up with Mark chapter 6 and verse 30. The passage we are about to read is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. Must have made a significant impression on the people of Jesus' day. Let's begin. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. If you'll recall, he had sent them out earlier on a mission to preach and perform miracles. And so now he is back they are back to him rather, after our interlude with a little history of John the Baptist. Then, because so many people were coming around were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." The fact that Jesus took vacations pleases me. Reminds us that we can't work ourselves to death. Now, right now, of course, we don't have a whole lot of choice in the matter, but we would do well to remember that a time of rest is a good thing. The very first story in the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, build in a day of rest. The law says keep the Sabbath. And there are rules about allowing not just humans to rest, but animals and the land itself. Rest is important. Don't wear yourself out. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Then Jesus landed and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups in the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples and set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. The disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who eaten was 5,000. Like I said, a familiar story, one recorded in all the Gospels, without a whole lot of variation. We're struck again by Jesus' nature in this passage. Not just his desire for himself and his disciples to rest, but his compassion on people looking for answers. He teaches them because they are so in need of guidance. Then he wants to feed them. And a lot of times we look at what God's calling us to do and we think, we don't have the resources. We don't have the means, the wherewithal to accomplish this task. And God says, well, start with what you have. Now, this is not a suggestion to be imprudent. It is not a suggestion to just willy-nilly go about starting things. But when we are sure we are called by God, it is a suggestion that God will provide in ways we don't understand. The trick, I suppose, is determining what is our will and what is the will of God. A lot of times we think, well, it sounds good to me, is sufficient, and it's not. We must be diligent and careful in determining the path for our life. We seek things prayerfully. We seek the advice of other Christians. We devote ourselves to study. We pray. We make a decision. But if we truly believe God is in it, we proceed knowing that God will provide. The impact the story makes on his followers is amazing. And it also tells us something else. Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, the parables, none of these are exactly the same in all the Gospels. The teachings of Jesus are important, but the thing that makes the impact for the average person is what meets their basic needs. Sometimes those needs are physical, sometimes they are emotional, sometimes they are spiritual. But we remember that God looks on us with compassion. A way is provided if we will be faithful. We continue with another familiar passage. In verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up to a mountainside to pray. Another thing about Jesus, he understands the importance of being alone sometimes. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining on the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." He climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. All right, the disciples who should know best understand sometimes the least in the book of Mark. In Luke's gospel, the disciples are depicted as the foundation of the church. In Mark, they're clueless. They are no more understanding than anyone else. Even sometimes those closest to Jesus didn't get the point. They misunderstood what they saw. They were confused. Now remember, in the context of Mark's gospel, his readers, or his audience, I suppose would be a better term, didn't know what was going on. They were suffering persecution. They were full of fear and anxiety. And thus, the depiction of the disciples goes along with what they were probably experiencing. It tells us something as well, that we may not always understand. We are no more special than they were. And you know what? It's okay. That's part of faith. Faith is almost by definition doing and following without understanding. If we understood, if we knew what was going to happen, it really wouldn't be faith then, would it? And so, we have here a group of disciples afraid at the manifestation of Jesus and not understanding anything. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, the people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats wherever they went, wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countrysides, they placed the sick in marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. Chapter 7, verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. They observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. All right, let me just stop here, given the enormity of the focus on hand washing nowadays. They're not talking about the same thing we're talking about. This is ritual hand washing. This is immersion of hands in water a certain number of times, doing certain actions. The goal is not cleanliness in the modern sense. The goal is ritual cleanliness. To go through the motions of removing contamination of sin, of things that would make you unclean. And they had no understanding of bacteria, viruses. This was them showing how holy they were. Not because they wanted to be healthy. They just wanted to make sure that everyone knew they were following the rules. And since the disciples weren't following the rules, it was a source of criticism. So the Pharisees and teacher of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with unclean hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men." He said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of God in order to observe your own traditions." I think that verse bears repeating. He said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions." More on that in a minute. For Moses says, "Honor your father and your mother, and anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death." But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, "Whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is korban," that is, a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. Okay. I could go on about this passage for a very long time. I will simplify matters and be a little more concise. How much of Christianity as we know it today is traditional American Christianity? In other words, how much of it is what we have added on rather than the will of God? There are people now talking about letting people die to save the economy, and they claim to be Christians. They claim Christian values, pro-family, pro-life when it comes time for election. But they would dishonor their fathers and mothers for the sake of profit. That's exactly what this passage is talking about. That saying, oh, I'm going to use this money for God, rather than taking care of my family. Jesus says it is a violation of God's law. Holding to the letter of it, observing it with the lips, but not the heart. How terrible for them and for us that we get so caught up in what we have been told is right, what we have been told we are supposed to do, that we fail to really consider what it is about. We fail to consider what is best for people. Honestly, in all of this, the thing that bothers me the most, the thing that worries me the most, is not sickness, which is terrible. Many people are going to die. Many families are going to be impacted. People you know are going to get sick. People you know of are going to die. But those who would abuse the situation for their own gain and own profit, those are the real enemy. A virus, we can come up with a vaccine, with treatments, with cures. But human selfishness, greed, self-aggrandizement, those things have been around for a very long time. And the only cure is a personal choice to follow God. Our only treatment is to not support people like that. Look carefully at what people do in a time of crisis. Honestly, look carefully at what people do all the time. Anyone who dares to speak for God invites criticism on themselves, and it is justified. If I claim to speak for God, which I do, that's my job, and I am not consistent in love, in a certain degree of humility and servanthood, then I am condemned. We must take our callings and the lessons of Jesus seriously. We will finish this passage. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, the disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. From within, out of a man's heart, come evil thoughts, immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Think not about what a person claims, but what they do. Think about yourself. Be your own judge. Love and compassion, a servant attitude, the diminishing of self. These are the characteristics of a Christian. Self-promotion, concern for wealth and power and status above anything else are ungodly. They are inherently anti-Christian. We need to be better. I hope I've given you something to think about, to consider today. Look at it carefully. We will continue our study tomorrow on Friday. We will pick up reading in chapter 7, verse 24. If you need me, please get in contact with me. If you have comments or questions about the book of Mark or anything else, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And that's not just the members of my congregation, but anybody else that might be looking at this. Thank you. I'll talk to you tomorrow.